Well, hello everyone. Thank you for watching this video. Um, so a lot of my past videos that I've posted on my YouTube channel have been pretty staged and pretty heavily edited. I think what I'm going to do with some of these videos, though, is that I'm simply going to say what I have to say and say what I think more so as my thoughts come along and let the chips fall where they may. I may do some shorter videos like I've done before, but I think I I have a lot that I have to say, and well, I need to say it, and so I'm going to start doing that more. I think in YouTube and other platforms, but I think especially YouTube is a good place to do that. So something that I've been thinking about lately is how do we conceptualize mental illness? How do we think about mental illness as it relates to someone, maybe a loved one that we're trying to help, or maybe our own thoughts that we have to deal with ourselves? How do we think about that? How do we think about things like depression and um, PTSD, ADHD, OCD, and all of the plethora of many other uh, mental illnesses? How do we think about them? And the reason why this is close to my heart in particular is I've dealt with mental illness for a long time in my life. I had Tourette's when I was younger, and that sort of morphed into, I don't know exactly how these two things are related exactly. I'm no expert on this, but sort of morphed into OCD tendencies when I became older, and I've developed with certain. I've dealt with certain subsets of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, throughout my life, especially in my young adult life. I think especially starting in my teenage years, although I did not know that that's what it was at the time. I dealt with a lot of intrusive thoughts and a lot of different categories. And I developed a lot of mental mechanisms for trying to get those thoughts to go away or to change. And that really didn't happen. And that really doesn't work. Um, if you understand what OCD is. I may explain more of what OCD is in another video, but I just simply say all that to say that um, I say what I am about to say more so from experience and not simply from judging other people. So I say this from my own personal experience. Maybe your own personal experience or your own thoughts on this are different. But I think I have something to say as far as contributing to the conversation about mental illness. So here we go. So how do we think about OCD? And there's really, I think, as I look out into the way that people conceptualize mental illness, especially among religious people, and I think I I speak within the context mainly of people who are religious, and particularly Christians, because that's what I am, and that's the type of people that I've often interacted with. Um, Among people that think about mental illness, I tend to run into two different types of thinking. One is that mental illness is a purely spiritual thing. It simply results as a lack of faith in God. And so if someone's dealing with depression and anxiety, the very simplistic answer is that, well, they just need more faith, or they need to pray more, they need to study more, they need to become more spiritually inclined, and that will help them. And there seems to be another school of thought that rebels much against that way of thinking, by comparing mental illness uh, to any other type of physical ailment, that it's something along the same lines as having a broken leg or heart disease or diabetes or some other unfortunate medical condition, and that it's something that to be medicated. And I first of all want to say that I am in no way completely against medication for helping people with mental illness. I personally have not taken any medication for my OCD. There's been times in my life where I've thought I might need it, and there might be times in my life where I change my mind on that, but I might not. But these seem to be sort of the two schools of thought, and there's a problem that I see in these two ways of thinking, is that they seem to be sort of an either or, black and white view of mental illness, and not just mental illness, but of the mind in particular. Because when you talk about mental illness, you're talking about the mind, and you cannot divorce mental illness completely from a conversation about the mind. So I think to understand mental illness, be able to talk about mental illness in the right context, we need to first of all have a good understanding of our own minds. And this is something that the way that I've thought about my own mind is, and the mind in particular, just in general, is something that I've been developing over my life as I've read the scriptures, I think I've come to a more mature understanding of what it means that we have a mind. Because if we don't have our minds, then do we really exist? that's a deep question that we could go into. But what is the mind? What is the mind really? Is it just this blob inside our skull that we call the brain? On the other hand, is it just something that's fully invisible, that's something that's completely detached from everything that's physical and material? And I don't think either one of these things are true. I think to rightly think about the mind, what the Bible calls the heart, the soul, the spirit. There's some distinctions between the soul, the spirit sometimes in the Bible. Maybe I can talk about that at another time. But at least when spiritually minded people, a lot of the times talk about the mind, the heart is often used to refer to it. And the mind, I think the best way to think about the mind, and I'm in no way an expert on this, but the mind, the heart, is something that involves both the physical and the spiritual, material and non-material, things that are beyond the material, that are what we call our mind does involve what we call the brain. And the brain is not something that is spiritual. And especially when you're speaking from in medical terms, our brains is a physical mass that sits between our ears, and it's something that you can take out of someone's head and hold in your hand. And so when we talk about the mind, we are dealing with something that is physical. But are we dealing with something that's purely physical? And when we say that someone has a mental problem, is it something that can exactly be compared to having a broken leg or some other medical condition? And I don't really quite think it's something that can be exactly compared to that, because the brain is not just physical. While it is physical, it's not just physical. It's something that is also spiritual. Our thoughts are not physical material things. And I know neuroscientists and such argue about what exactly thoughts are. Are they just chemical reactions in the brain? Is there something more to it? What is consciousness? All of these things are conversations that we could talk about. But I think if you looked at it in more simplistic terms, if someone were to ask, are thoughts real? I would have to say, well, it depends on what you mean by thought. Um, a thought is not a physical thing like our brains are a physical thing. You can't see your thoughts. Your thoughts are not something that you can reach out and touch in the corporeal world. Our thoughts are something that exists beyond the material, at least in a normal sense of talking about the material world. But does that mean they are not real? And so, and I don't think that's the case. I think thoughts are very real, but they're not real in the sense that they're material. They're real in another sense, though. In fact, they're so real that our thoughts are a very precondition of our existence. We wouldn't exist the way we do without our thoughts. And so, without our thoughts, we would simply be this mindless thing in a body. So our thoughts are something beyond uh, just our physical brain, you might say. And I know some people might want to argue about that. I think biblically, though, you could make a case that as far as our mind is concerned, our thoughts and our feelings and our emotions are things that, while they are attached to the mind, the brain, and they are things that happen within our head, they are far more than things that are just material and physical. And so I've said all of that to say that when we talk about the mind, the human mind, we're dealing with something unlike any other thing. And to compare the human mind, I think, to anything would be to do it injustice. To try and say, well, the mind is like this. You could say, well, the mind is like a sophisticated computer. I think you run into all sorts of problems with that. And if you say, well, the mind is just like any other part of your body, and to have a mental illness is simply to be sick in a way like you're sick in any other way. I think that's to do the mind an injustice. But on the other hand, I think to say that the mind is purely spiritual is to dismiss the fact that we actually do have a physical brain that sits between our ears, and there are things that happen in our brain. So that the mind is this thing that sits between the physical and the things that are beyond the physical. What we call our mind is something that sort of sits between two planes of existence, the physical and what we might call the spiritual. And I believe that's inevitable. Our minds are both spiritual and physical in its makeup. And so to treat the things that happen in our mind purely in a physical way is, I think, a horrible misunderstanding. But I also think that if we treat what happens in our minds as something that is purely spiritual, I think we run into the same problems. They're both they're both ways of looking at the mind are too simplistic. The mind is more complex than that. And so when we talk about mental illness, I don't think we can say that it's as simple as saying, well, it's like having a broken leg, or it's like, having diabetes. Let's just give you a pill and medicate you and send you home to get better. It's like, I don't think we can just treat mental illness like that. But I also don't think we can just say, well, it's something that, well, you just need to pray more, or you just need to you just need to have more faith. And I think in my own experience, I've learned that when we're dealing with mental illness, or at least in dealing with my own mental illness, I think there's both physical problems that I've identified and spiritual problems that I've identified. And my OCD has gotten better over the years. And as it has gotten better over the years, I have been able to identify physical aspects of my OCD, things that were actually wrong with my brain as far as my physical health is concerned. um, I've been able to identify things that have actually helped my brain to function in a healthier way. um, but I've also learned that as I've grown spiritually, as I have developed my faith, as I've come to a better understanding of myself and the world and God and my relationship with Him, that has also helped my OCD tremendously. And I think, for me to just basically camp in only one place instead of looking at my own mental illness in a more holistic way, I think that that's helped me, not to just camp in one place. And so, um, what is it? What is it about? First of all, uh, what are the physical things that I've identified with my OCD? What are the health aspects of my brain that I said I identified? Well, I learned over the years that I have a lot healthier brain when I eat right. I learned several years ago by going on a very strict elimination diet that I actually was allergic to gluten, to bread, to wheat products, and I started backing off for slowly for a period of time. Actually, at this point, have gotten off of gluten pretty much completely, besides the little piece that I have for communion every Sunday. And I will have to say, I don't think that my my brain has never been healthier at any point in my life. I mean, I can just feel it being off of that allergen, just not eating it. And I know my wife can testify to the fact when I eat something that I shouldn't eat, I feel on edge. I am more anxious with no reason for it. I'm just anxious. I just my teeth are set on edge, for about a day or two, after eating gluten, and then after that's cleared out of my system, it eases up. And I got to thinking about in my early 20s, man, my OCD was just horrible. I mean, I went through some very, very dark mental times, and I ate a lot of bread during those times. I mean, I ate a lot of pizza, a lot of hamburgers, just and I eat those things still now, but I get gluten-free buns and such for that. And cauliflower pizzas. I've learned all of the ways around it and so forth. And I just that one thing that I've changed as far as my lifestyle is concerned is a physical change that has helped my OCD tremendously. But I think I would do a disservice to my own mind to say that, well, that was the problem with my OCD, and that, like, that's what caused the OCD. It's like, no, even off of gluten, I can still tell those OCD tendencies are still there. They're just not as pronounced, and they sometimes get the better of me even off of the gluten, just depending on the situation and so forth. So I'm not saying I'm healed because I'm off of gluten. No, but that's something that has helped it. But I will also have to say that as I've grown spiritually, as I have developed my faith, um, as I've developed my relationship with God, and my brethren, which I think are developing good, healthy relationships with other people, by the way, is one thing that can tremendously help you with your OCD. I would say my marriage has really helped me with my OCD. Having the good wife that I do has truly helped me with it. She's there for me. She understands, and she often is a great help. It's a learning curve for her, learning process for her as well for me. So I think as I've developed spiritually over my life, there's a peace that I have now that I know I did not have before. And it's very strange. I've noticed it. over the past few years, slowly developing, and you might call it the fruit of the Spirit, because I believe that's what it is. But and so for me to say that, like so many people say, that, well, this idea that OCD has or mental illness has nothing to do with faith, I think that's preposterous. I think it has everything to do with our faith. I think mental illness has everything to do with the way we see the world and the way that we see ourselves, and or at least maybe some form, maybe not be so absolute about that. But I do think some types of mental illness absolutely have to do with the way that we see the world, the way we see ourselves. They have to do with what we are serving in our life, what we have our faith in. And it has a lot to do with our past history as well, the experiences that we have had, and so forth, and sometimes the trauma that we have from that, and the incorrect thinking patterns, as one of my friends would call it, how those develop from our past experiences and so forth. And so when we talk about mental illness, this sort of black and white, either or, either, well, you need to pray more or you need to take a pill. I think either I don't even want to call them extremes, because they're so similar in their ways of thinking, in some sense. But I don't think either ways of those types of thinking are the way to deal with mental illness. I think we have to approach it in a more holistic way, to realize that we are physical beings. We have a body and we have a brain, and that's inevitable. And what we do to our bodies will ultimately affect the way that we think, and our health will ultimately affect the way that we think. But we're spiritual beings as well, and that cannot be denied. That's also inevitable. And to completely divorce mental illness from the realm of the spiritual, I think, is one of the greatest mistakes of our time. And so anyway, these are just some thoughts I had. Just wanted to share them with you. I'm probably wrong about some. I'm probably wrong about some of the way that I think. Like I said, my way of thinking about this is still developing. It's been developing over the years, and I'll probably learn more and change my mind on some things. But I do believe, and I am convicted, that a more holistic approach, not this black and white either or way of looking at mental illness, but a more holistic approach to it, a more balanced view of being able to hold two aspects of it at once before us is the way towards healing, is the path towards healing. And it's anything but simple. It's anything but simple. We need possibly to change some things in our physical life. We may also need to change some things in our spiritual life, and we may need to get help. We're going to need help from people in either one of those two categories. So thank you all for listening. Hope this helps you.